All right, so welcome to the Lifetime Repertoire's Semi-Slav Short and Sweet series. So the express goal of this series is to make you buy the real one. So obviously I'm not going to show you all of the best stuff here, but I think this is a good place for you to start and see generally the kind of thing that you can expect in the Semi-Slav and the kind of analysis and the quality that I'm going to bring. So the first thing to realize is that while the Semi-Slav proper is definitely going to be the most critical part of the series, so like you'll see after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, e6. Like I spend most of the series considering this position because it's very critical, and White's two main moves are bishop g5 and e3, and I have a lot of analysis against both of them. White also can play like g3 here and queen d3 and stuff like that, which definitely what you want to be ready for. But White also has some sidelines available, and particularly at club level, you're going to want to know what to do against the sidelines. So for example, one sideline that you might see very early in the game from a lot of club level players is the Cole system, where he tries to play with knight f3 and b3 and get the bishop to b2. And this is not wildly challenging, but it's somewhat dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. So after knight f3, knight f6, e3, I want to play c6, which fits in with our repertoire very nicely. White should probably play c4 here and transpose back to the mainline Slav, but into the semi-Slav, and then that would be after c4. We'd be in my opinion, what is the most mainline position against the Slav move order nowadays, because a lot of people are playing with e3 instead of knight c3, specifically trying to avoid the semi-Slav. And I came up with what I think is a very nice idea here that. Well, I am unwilling to share with people who haven't yet bought the course. But I think I was actually this chapter here where White plays with e3. So the proper move order would be like d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, and now e3 to reach the same position. Yeah, you'll have to buy the course to get what I want here, because it's I was very happy with what I found, and this is one of the main lines that White can try. But let's suppose that White instead tries knight f3 and then plays e3 first, and after c6 wants to avoid playing c4. Here I actually I quite like getting my bishop out to f5 if at all possible. For example, after c4, if I were to play bishop f5, there's this variation where White goes knight c3, e6, and knight h4. And this is definitely interesting, and I've played this for Black several times with some success. I played it quite a bit last year. And maybe this is the recommendation, maybe not. But there's some challenges by the bishop coming out there. You can also hope for bishop g4. One thing White can try is bishop d3. And his point with this move is that he's stopping bishop f5. But after bishop g4, essentially what's happened here is we've transposed to a variation of the Slav after, say, c4, e6, where if White had played c4 on the previous move, and then Black played bishop g4 here, this is one of the very main variations of the Slav. And then we would basically be forcing White to play bishop d3, and then after e6, we would reach our analysis here. But the thing is, bishop d3 is not the best move. White's best try is to play h3, bishop h5, g4, and then go after this bishop after something like bishop g6, knight e5, and hope to use the bishop pair to his advantage. And here I think White has chances to fight for an edge. But because White is sort of forced into playing this move bishop d3, given his move order, committing to bishop d3 a second ago with bishop d3 here. Now after bishop g4, c4, e6, I'm not at all worried about Black's position because he can proceed with normal development like knight b d7 and bishop d3, and he's totally fine. The big reason is that White doesn't have an opportunity to chase this bishop and try to take the bishop pair. For example, if h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, he can't go play knight h4 and take the bishop pair because I'll simply trade light squared bishops and just be better. White could play knight b d2. And after knight b d7, castles, bishop d6, queen c2, and castle. Here already Black is doing very well because he's ready to play e5 next and break in the center. And it's important to know that a position like this one can sometimes be unpleasant for Black if his bishop is stuck on c8. But here with the bishop all the way out on g4, a luxury that White afforded him by playing this move order where he delayed c4, there's nothing much for Black to be scared of. And of course note that e4 would not be advised for White because after d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and f5, White's pawn structure will get shattered by bishop takes f3 next, and he's already entirely lost. So there's a little bit more to the Cole system than that, but as you may have guessed, this is all I'm willing to share, and you'll have to move on to see it. White can also try the Tory attack, where he goes for knight f3 and bishop g5, But I think I managed to challenge this pretty nicely as well. For instance, after d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop g5. This is the Tory attack, and it makes some sense against different move orders from black. Like if black were playing the Grunfeld or the King's Indian, this setup isn't so terrible. But against the Queen's Gambit, I don't think it makes very much sense, and I want to immediately chase this bishop with knight e4. Now, white's main move is bishop h4, and I have a pretty wild and wacky idea there that I was very happy with that, as you may have guessed, you will have to buy the main course to see. But every now and then you'll see whites play something like bishop f4 as well. And this is not particularly challenging because after c5, black is challenging the center very quickly. If c3, black can, for example, take on d4 and play queen b6 with good pressure against the b2 pawn and a good version of the Exchange Slav where he got knight e4 for free, which normally he doesn't get to do. White will probably play e3. And now after queen b6, once again, black has good pressure on the b2 pawn because white is not in time to play queen b3, which he would really like to do. He probably has to play something like queen c1. And then after knight c6, c3, here black is going to be fine no matter what he does, but I actually quite like this idea to play f6 and try to start playing g5 and h5 to harass this bishop that came out to f4 before it was really ready. And this is in stark contrast to the London system, where if white had played bishop f4 in one move instead of black allowing black to get knight e4 for free, then he would probably be okay here. But as is with g5 and h5 on the way, this bishop's going to get chased, for example, after knight bd2, g5, bishop g3, and h5. It's very hard for white to get an acceptable position because black is threatening h4 to trap the bishop, and if white tries to give it room with h4, there's always knight takes g3, ruining the structure. And after gf3 and g4 with queen c7 and bishop h6 to come, white has already just lost. White doesn't have to play quite this badly, but in general, I think already after knight e4, I'm pretty comfortable with black, and I believe that black is already fighting for an advantage as early as move 3. Again, bishop h4 is the main move, but at least until you buy the main series, I'm going to keep it to myself what sort of spicy idea I had in mind there. So white also could try the Varisov. This is the recommendation of Simon Williams in his course here on Chessable, and while it's a very common, well, not super common, but it's a common sideline and kind of tricky and dangerous. But as I've mentioned in the introduction and whatnot, all throughout this course, I think I do a very good job of addressing basically every single piece of chess literature or media that I could find. I've spent a lot of my own money on all sorts of chess books and video courses and online databases, basically finding every single repertoire that I could that recommends d4 on the first move for white. And I made sure to address all of them very carefully and throughout this series, exactly where I leave their analysis or where I disagree with their conclusions, and what to expect if you're playing somebody who's following those repertoires, because a lot of players from club level to grandmaster are really making use of these repertoires that are being published and following them in their own games. So if you ever come across someone following one of these repertoires, you will know exactly when I will leave their analysis and what I'm recommending against them. So I made sure to take Williams' recommendation seriously. For example, after d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, the mainline Varisov nowadays goes bishop f4. Bishop g5 was the old move, which isn't so challenging, but we're going to focus on bishop f4 for now. And here, there's a lot of different ways of playing, but the way I recommend in the course is e6. And I think now for sure the best move is knight b5, which, for example, was recently played by Goryachkina in a must-win game against Ju Wenjun in the Women's World Championship. And while white's certainly not better and black needs to know what they are doing, it was clearly something that Ju Wenjun had not properly studied, because she quickly made a very bad move and as a result and didn't understand the position and got a very bad one. So it's important to know what you're doing against this line, even if it's not great. E3 is not nearly as good. I think after E3, white's already worse. That's Simon's recommendation. But for this short and sweet, we're only going to focus on knight b5 for now. And after knight a6, here after e3, I believe Ju Wenjun played bishop b4 check c3 and bishop back to e7, which was a fundamental misunderstanding of the position, because white wanted to play c3 anyway, and now white is in time to play a4, when after c6, the knight can freely come back to a3 without the pawn structure getting compromised. This isn't that bad for black yet, but I think white got exactly what she wanted, and because Ju Wenjun hadn't studied this line properly, she quickly got a somewhat unpleasant position. Instead, it's better to start with bishop e7, understanding that the pawn is actually better on c3. You shouldn't provoke it there. And after knight f3, castle, the big problem that white is facing is that on all of these structures, what he, or in this case, in that game actually, she would really want to do is bring the bishop to d3, which is something that cannot be done now, or at least not comfortably, because after bishop d3, c6, and this knight comes back to c3 after knight b4, the bishop turns out to be unstable and will just get harassed. So as a result, white can't really bring the bishop to the most active square, but white would like to play c3, which, you know, Jew and June allowed for free, but here if white were to play c3 after c6, because white hasn't played a4 yet, after knight a3, black is able to butcher the pawn structure. So here, white probably should content themselves with playing bishop e2, but this also isn't very scary because the bishop isn't coming to the most active place. And after c6, knight c3, and now c5, this position, it doesn't make much sense for white, mainly because this knight on c3 is just so badly misplaced. We're certainly not worried about our pawns becoming doubled, as after ba6, the bishop pair means much more, and black can proceed with a5 and bishop a6. Instead, after castle, bishop d7, knight e5, and bishop back to e8. A position like this one could be dangerous if white was able to secure the bishop on d3, but they can't because it will always get met by knight b4. And black will probably play knight b4 anyway next, and if it gets kicked with a3, bring the knight back to c6 to exert further pressure upon white's center. Probably it's still more or less equal, but I already prefer black. So I think this was a very good recommendation against the Varisov, but you do have to know what you're doing. So of all the sidelines out there that white can try against after d4 without going into the Queen's Gambit, I believe the best one is the London system, which you should know what you're doing against, but I was pretty happy with what I found. So after d4, d5, bishop f4 is probably the move order most people would use. They could play knight f3, but a good rule of thumb is whenever white plays bishop f4, you want to play c5, and you don't want to play it before. And if white plays bishop f4, you should play c5 directly. So I like playing c5 right now. There's reasons that it's important to do this instead of, for example, delaying by playing knight f6 and then c5 next, but well, not going to share that here. Instead, after c5, e3, this would be the automatic move that a London system player would make. And now you just have to be careful not to let white take on c5. So I like the move knight c6. And now d takes c5 doesn't work so well because of e5. And after c3, this is the move order that Nikola Sedlak recommended in his book on the London system, which I think is the only really serious London system repertoire I could find, at least, that advocated playing the London. This is a clever move order from Sedlak because white wants to make sure he's ready to meet queen b6 with queen b3. And it's actually a bit tough if you don't know what you're doing. For example, if you play like knight f6 here after knight bd2. I'm not convinced black is equalizing here. It's not that easy to develop this bishop because as soon as the bishop comes out, there might follow queen b3. And after queen b6, queen b3, the general move you want to play when the queens are looking at each other like this is c4. Because if you were to develop e6, now this bishop is stuck. And if you put your bishop outside the pawn chain, d takes c5 will come and b7 is hanging. So the move you kind of want to play is c4 and punish white by gaining space. Queen b6 is never good. This endgame is always great for black. You can try queen c2 though, and here white is better. This was Sedlak's recommendation because the main point is that now your tactical shot bishop f5 doesn't work because queen takes f5, queen b2. This rook is not trapped because white's played knight b1 to d2. But I think I found a very nice antidote to Sedlak's repertoire with bishop f5. And the point is that now black wants to play queen b6 next, and when white plays queen b3, he wants to play c4 at such a moment when white cannot retreat the queen back to c2. And this, I think, equalizes very comfortably. For example, after knight d2, e6, knight gf3, queen b6. Here, queen b3, c4 should be good for black because queen c2 can't come. Sedlak recommended knight h4. I don't think he covered this specific position. I don't believe he considered bishop f5, but knight h4 was his general plan in these lines when black played bishop f5 and e6 to try to chase the knight. So he was always playing stuff like queen b3 to provoke queen b6 and then go harass this bishop. And here you should know that for the most part, whenever this bishop gets harassed by either knight h4 or g4 in any line, just go bishop e4 first, provoke f3, and then bring the bishop back. Here after queen b3, for example, black can't play c4 anymore because the e4 bishop is hanging, but following h6, white is unable to capture this bishop because after knight takes e4, d e4, he can't stop losing a piece with g5 since his knight is trapped, and if he tries to make room with moving the g-pawn, he'll still be forked. So white can play knight hf3, and after bishop h7, black has a very comfortable position. He got his bishop outside the pawn chain, and it's not super obvious to me what white accomplished with knight h4 back to f3. And after queen takes b6, a b6, white can try bishop c7 to grab a pawn. But after c4, this same plan of b5, b4 is extremely strong, even a pawn down. After bishop takes b6, knight f6, this bishop's going to get trapped, and then black will win a pawn. For example, the only way for this bishop to escape and avoid something like bishop d6 followed by knight d7, when white will, well, I mean, he won't lose a piece because the bishop can go to c5, but he will lose a pawn back and have a very bad position. The only way to avoid getting trapped is bishop c7, and the bishop's free to run back to g3. But after b5, even a pawn down, this plan of b5 followed by b4, taking all the space on the queen side, leaves white with a horrible position. White can play better than this, and the London has been played in other ways than Sedlak's recommendation. Like Magnus has been playing it recently and been doing a different move order, but I was pretty happy with this, which is, you know, a way, sort of one of the antidotes to like the kind of books that I'm talking about throughout the course. You know, sometimes, so if someone's following Sedlak's repertoire, this will be good enough. But white can also play the London system in other ways. So moving on to what happens if white plays c4 on the second move. The bane of every Slav player's existence is if white takes on d5. And really, this is more about I think, well, the line is actually challenging nowadays. It's also a lot about psychology with black. Nobody likes to see this move. Even though it's not the best move, nobody wants to see it because it's boring and it's very hard to take over the initiative. But the psychology of it is important. Your goal should be to equalize, make some small imbalance, not a big one. You're never going to be able to make a big one, but just develop your pieces a little bit differently than white does, and then play a long game with a lot of pieces on the board. That's usually enough to have chances to outplay somebody. The Exchange Slav also, nowadays, it used to only be played by total cowards who were just insulting the game by playing c takes d5 and trying to kill chess, basically, and make it as risk-free as possible and as boring as possible, and often just wanted to make draws with white. There are still people like that, but I actually think nowadays they're the minority of Exchange Slav players. Most of them are actually trying to fight for the advantage, and for a long time, people thought black was equalizing very easily. I don't think this is the case. I actually think he has to be pretty accurate. And it was actually one of the longer chapters that I had to record because there's a fair amount of analysis and a fair amount to understand. But black is definitely fine if he knows what he's doing. So c takes d5, c takes d5, knight c3, knight f6. You could play knight c6 here as well, but white can avoid that anyway by first playing knight c3. And here, since you have to play knight f6, and now white could play c takes d5, there's no way you could avoid this position anyway. So say cd5, cd5, knight c3, knight f6. White has some wild and wacky ways of playing the Exchange Slav as well as the quieter ones. So here I've seen this move f3 now and then. It escaped my attention at first. I didn't even cover it in the course when I first turned it in, but one of the editors said, you know, this move actually has a little bit of a following and you should check it. And it turns out actually that it's a little bit more dangerous than it looks. I mean, it looks pretty bad to block in this knight, but white wants to play e4. The lucky thing about this is white's only plan is e4, and I quite like this very rare move. I'm not quite sure if it's a novelty, but it's very rare. This idea to play queen b6. And this point is basically just prophylaxis against white's development, because I think it's very hard for white to get e4 through comfortably. He can't develop this bishop now, and he can't develop the knight. Really, the only way white can justify playing this variation is if he plays e4 here, and just sort of in for a penny, in for a pound. But we now see why this queen on b6 is so good, is that after d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, black is striking back in the center and abusing the long diagonal. And probably white's best move is knight f3, which is very sad. You're unlikely to see that because it's just, it seems like you're capitulating. White will more likely play something like bishop b5 check, or d5, or d takes e5. And you need to know what you're doing in all of these cases, and I do cover all those moves, but objectively best, although very unlikely to be seen practically, is knight f3. And after e takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop c5, queen e5 check, and bishop e6. Black is developing incredibly fast. He's ready to go knight bd7 or knight c6, can castle on either side, and his pieces are just springing to life, and white's position already looks absolutely miserable to me, and I think black is pleasantly better. So while this is sort of a fringe line of the Exchange Slav, it's important to know what to do. I made sure to take care of all of these sidelines. I mean, people face sidelines all the time. I don't know why everyone is so obsessed with playing sidelines, but a lot of people play them, and And I made sure that I was ready for all of them, so you'll be ready for them in this course. And this one, for example, is an example of the kind of depth you can see when I cover the sidelines. So instead of this, white can also try playing the exchange. White can also try playing the Exchange Slav in a more positional way. You go d4, d5, c4, c6, take on d5, and instead of playing knight f3, instead of playing f3, white can just continue his development with bishop f4, which is probably what you'll face more often, but you do get some guys who play it pretty wildly. After knight c6, e3, I'm recommending the a6 line where you delay the development of the c8 bishop to try to remain flexible. White's most common choice here in history by far is bishop d3, but I actually think it's not that challenging, and white is better off playing bishop e2, which is the choice of Alexei Dreyev in his book on the Exchange Slav, which came out, I think, just a few years ago, and was actually a very challenging book, and he had a very interesting way of playing with white that I think a lot of people have copied, and you definitely want to be ready for. But again, I cover that in the main course, but I'll stick with the most common move, bishop d3, in this short but sweet part. Following bishop d3, in general, I've always said you want to develop your bishops different than white does. And so here, because white brought his bishop to f4, first of all, you can't bring your bishop to f5 because the square is hanging. But this is a good time to play bishop g4. And now white is always playing knight ge2 in this position. Black can just go e6, castles, bishop d6. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and black's ready to complete his development with castling next. And he's ready to play the e5 advance pretty soon. He's not scared of having an isolated pawn just because this pin on the knight on e2 is very scary and for white, and it's hard to break because f3 would leave white with a backwards pawn on e3. And the position is not particularly bothersome. So for example, after rook c1, castle, knight a4. Knight a4 is a very typical theme for white in the Exchange Slav, particularly in this line where black plays a6, because then when he plays knight c5, he's pressuring both these pawns, and b6 is hard to pull off. But as we'll frequently see throughout the course, black gets counterplay in the center. And here after e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5, black is absolutely fine. And if he ever feels this isolated pawn on d5 is a serious weakness, it should be very easy to get d4 through with just rook a, d8, and d4 to liquidate everything. I think he doesn't usually have to be that direct, but this should be fine. And the big point is that it's not an f3. E2 isn't very good. It would have been much better on f3 to stop black from playing e5, but there wasn't really a great way for it to get there without this bishop on g4 being annoying. Here, if white were to play something like h3 and you just took on e2, already you're getting d4 through, and black should be very comfortable. So there's a lot more to the Exchange Slav than that, and regrettably, I have to say, it's a challenging opening. I mean, it's not just like, oh, play a few accurate moves, equalize, and grit your teeth because your opponent is such a coward. No, the Exchange Slav is serious, and it is played by guys who are fighting for an advantage, often played by guys who are willing to take risks later on. And you do have to know what you're doing, but, well, this is a good teaser as to the way I want to play. I think it's pretty effective. So, moving on, we're finally going to start looking at the Semi-Slav proper. So we reached this position. The move order that I'm recommending is playing d4, d5, c4, c6. But if you like playing the Nimzo Indian, for example, if you don't like playing against the Exchange Slav, and you like playing the Nimzo Indian, but you don't like playing against knight f3, you could certainly play a move order like this one. Meet knight c3 with bishop b4, meet knight f3 with d5, and you'd have to be ready for the Catalan too, but realistically, you could play that as well. So the Semi-Slav is kind of nice in that you have other move orders, but the only one I'm covering in the course is the Slav. In any case, after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, this is the main position of the Semi-Slav. And the most critical moves by far are e3 and bishop g5, but g3 is somewhat interesting as well, but it's not too hard to deal with. If white can complete his development, he'll be better because he'll get a good version of the Catalan where you played c6, which is not the best line. But black is able to grab this pawn on c4 and try to hang on to it. After bishop g7, I like the move knight bd7, which stops knight e5. White will win. If white plays a4, you're not going to be able to save this pawn, but that's okay because it will take white a long time to take it, sort of in the same style of the classical Slav. Here, it's really hard to figure out how it's going to get captured. After bishop b4, castle, castle, queen c2, I like the move a5, securing the b4 square. Black could have tried to hang on to the c4 pawn more aggressively, but I think this is a very simple solution. The only way that, white can win the pawn back now, but it will cost him some time. It's very natural to see him develop with a move like bishop f4 trying to complete his development. But the bishop is only a target. You will go knight d5, and you're never worried about knight takes d5, because then you're just a pawn up. This pawn is totally safe now, and black is basically winning. So white will just have to retreat the bishop, and here black is already better. White can play better than that, but black is still fine, no matter how he plays. More to the point in the Semi-Slav is with g3 is that white can just sacrifice this pawn and try to accelerate his development. So after bishop g2, knight bd7, instead of a4, which is really slow, and well, it does win the pawn back, it leaves black with very comfortable equality. After castle b5, now white will not get the pawn back and instead has to look for counterplay, because if black is able to just play like bishop e7, bishop b7, and castle in the next 3 moves, he's just winning. Like, he's a pawn up for dead nothing. So white has to make something happen. The only thing I could figure out for him to try was e4 and try to crash through in the center before black completes his development. But I like this simple move, bishop b7. Black stops d5 and forces white directly into action. After e5, knight d5, knight g5, black has to be a little bit careful because queen h5 could come, but after a very forcing sequence, h6, white now sort of has to take on e6, because if he retreats the knight, again, black will just complete his development with a very easy advantage. After knight takes e6, f e6, queen h5 check, king e7, knight e4. With knight d6 coming and this king stuck in the center, it looks very dangerous, but a very strong move is queen e8. When now white, if black's king is allowed to escape either to d8 and c7, he's going to win very easily. Or if he escapes to f7 and g8, in both cases, he's just a clean piece up. So white should play bishop g5 check. You have to take this bishop. And after queen takes h8, king d8, knight takes g5. This position is very interesting, and for a long time it was considered very critical. And I found a new move here that I think has only been played once before in queen e7, which is very nice move. It's questioning the stability of this knight and forcing white to defend it, and also clearing the e8 square for the rook to come to. So for example, after h4, king c7, white's best move is probably a4, and here I like king b6, just sort of hiding the king over there. I mean, it looks strange to charge the king ahead, but he's covered by his pawns pretty well, and we're not exactly scared of white's queen on h8 coming to mate the king on b6. And here, this position is very complicated. Stockfish claims it's equal, but I quite like black's position. I think it's easier to play. He can look for a6, c5 later, maybe a5, knight b4, knight d3. But it's still a big mess, and you definitely need to know what you're doing. And white has other options along the way that you have to be ready for. I mean, this is a very sharp line, and if you're not ready, you can get into some trouble, but I was very happy with what I found. Moving into some slightly more direct stuff. After d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, knight c3. In this case, white used an e3 move order to reach the Moran, but he could have played knight c3 as well. So, for example, white could play knight c3 here, and then e6, e3. This reaches the Moran, and here there's black should play knight bd7, and white can play either bishop d3 or queen c2. And after queen c2, bishop d6, white can play. Probably the most challenging is to move his bishop on f1, which leads to some of the mainline Moran positions, and I'll give you a little teaser on one of those in a bit. He can also play b3, but the most wild move is g4, which I don't think is very challenging because black can play h6, and I think that white's kingside attack is not going to succeed because black hasn't actually castled kingside yet. Well, in the meantime, by playing g4, he's made sure his own king will never have a happy home if the center opens, which I believe it will. For example, the most direct move is rook g1, hoping for potentially g5, knight takes g5, and then knight takes f7 and queen g6. And you could imagine white's attack becoming pretty dangerous. But after e5, black is opening the center immediately. Now, white has better moves, but if you were to just keep on pressing ahead with his caveman-style play of g5, after hg, knight takes g5 and queen e7, I think white's already more or less lost. h2 is hanging, d4 is hanging, black's king is totally safe, the center's opening, and already here white's basically crushed, so this is pretty bad. Again, white can play better, but we'll go back and see a line where he does better, which is in this same position, after knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d6, g4, h6. I think the only way that white can stop black from playing e5 is bishop d2. But then we can continue along in the standard style of the Moran, with d takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop e2, and bishop b7. And here, if black is able to get the c6 to c5 advance through, he should have a very good position. And I believe he will. The last important thing is like if white plays e4, this position has been seen quite a few times, and actually for a long time the theory claimed that white was supposed to be better, but then Aronian found this move bishop e7, which is very strong, pointing out that he's ready to meet e5 with b4. He gets the bishop out of the way, and then he's ready to play c5 next. And already I think black is better. Carlsen played g5 here against Aronian and quickly got a horrible position. After e5, b4, knight a4, and knight d5, black's ready to play like rook c8, queen a5, and force c5 through. And usually in the Moran, whenever he gets c5 and his pieces spring to life, he's doing very well. And in this position, it should be very clear that this g4 move, it's not making black's king feel particularly unsafe. I mean, maybe if black just castles straight into attack, it'll be a problem. But I think he's not going to castle right away. He's going to instead prioritize playing rook c8 and c5 and getting his pieces out. Again, there's a lot more to this line that you should know if you go ahead and buy the real course. But this is a good teaser, and already here, black is better. So moving back, after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e3. After knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d6, the polar opposite of g4, which is wild and wacky and aggressive, is b3, which is very calm and much more reserved, where white's just trying to complete his development and get his pieces out and keep everything solid and maybe play a longer game and keep things closed. But black is definitely fine. After castle, white has to be careful about the move e5 next. The best way to avoid that is bishop e2, which is clearly the most critical move, has been played a lot recently. I actually faced it in the last time I played against the Semi-Slav. Bishop e2 was played against me. And black is definitely fine, but he needs to know what he's doing, and you'll have to, well, go to the main course for that. If white tries bishop d3, which is the more active square for the bishop, here after e5, black is doing extremely well. For example, white can try giving him an isolated pawn with cd5, cd5, de5, knight e5, knight e5, and bishop e5. But here, white is unable to stop d4, which will immediately liquidate the position. And in fact, white has to be a little bit careful because black's pieces are better coordinated, and he has to worry a little bit about this diagonal. It's definitely about equal, but if I had to take a side, it would be black. White should have preferred bishop e2 instead of bishop d3 to avoid this idea. White also can play bishop b2, like we'll see in this game here. d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e3, queen c2, bishop d6, b3, castle. And again, as I mentioned, I believe that the best move by far is bishop e2, and it's been most common. Bishop b2 is a mistake, but it's important to know what you're doing. I remembered most of my analysis against Jorge Tory in a game last summer, and should have just been better, but forgot one thing and ended up much worse instead. After e5, black is ready to get e4 through and gain a whole bunch of space. White's best attempt to stop this is to take on e5, but after knight e5 castle, you're pretty comfortable sacrificing this pawn on d5. After queen e7, I think white also really has to take that pawn too, because if he lets you play d takes c4, you're going to really pressure his king. So after something like knight c takes d5, c takes d5, white's best move is knight takes e5, and then black has to be a little bit accurate, but he's definitely fine. If instead he takes on d5 first, then after knight takes d5, rook takes d5, knight takes f3, g takes f3, and bishop e6, here already white is losing material because rook a c8 is on the way and the rook is hanging. And for example, after rook g1, looking for counterplay on g7, black can comfortably play g6. And again, once this rook moves, rook a c8 comes, and white's going to have to self-pin and on the c file and cause himself all kinds of trouble. Here already black is clearly better. So moving on to like the proper Moran, which is one of the most serious attempts against the Semi-Slav. After d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6. Again, white could play either knight c3 or e3 here. Just reaches this position, knight c3, knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d6, bishop d3, castle, castle, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop e2. And now I like the move bishop b7. And here the most critical move by far is e4, and you really are going to have to know what you're doing there. But the old move is rook d1. And one thing that, and here I like the move queen c7. And again, white needs to go for e4 here, and then black is fine if he knows what he's doing. But he could also try something like bishop d2, just developing and hoping to get b4 through. Eventually, if white can play b4 and secure it, he's often better, but this is not the case here. After a6, now black is ready for c5, and as you'll frequently see in the Semi-Slav, as soon as c5 comes, black always has a good position. White can try b4, hoping that you'll fall for bishop takes b4, knight takes b5, when white gets his pawn back with the bishop pair in a basically winning position. But you won't be so foolish and instead counterattack in the center with e5. And after bishop d3, rook f e8, white actually has to be pretty careful now because you weren't threatening bishop takes b4. Like if you took on b4 here, knight b5 is good. But after rook f e8, now you're threatening to take for real because if white, I don't know, plays like rook ac1, after bishop takes b4, knight b5 doesn't work because at the end of all this, e4 will come and black will win a piece. So here white has to defend the pawn or something. I mean, it's easy. I checked what happens if he takes on e5, but releasing the tension is seldom a good idea. And after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, white's going to have to spend a tempo defending the h2 pawn, and black will play c5 next when his pieces are springing to life, and already here black is clearly better. So within bishop e2, we can go back to this line again, c4, c6, e3, and again, you can play knight c3, move over 2. You'll get this position. So queen c2, bishop d6, bishop d3, castle, castle, dc4, bishop c4, b5, and white can play bishop d3, which we'll briefly discuss in a moment. But after bishop e2, bishop b7, rook d1, queen c7, as I mentioned, the best move is e4, but you're always going to meet e4 with e5, and black should be fine. After bishop g5, one key thing you need to know is that after e takes d4, rook takes d4, knight e5, you don't need to worry about bishop takes f6. It's not particularly dangerous. I mean, you have to know what you're doing, so you'll have to, as again, you're going to be annoyed with me shamelessly plugging myself for so long, but you'll have to buy the course to see. White's second most common move is g3. And now after bishop c5, rook d2, knight fg4, black is able to avoid the doubled pawns, and he's counterattacking this this pawn on f2. White's rook f1 is not a great move, but it's a very natural move that I would imagine a human would make. And after f6, bishop f4, knight takes f3 check, bishop takes f3, knight e5, bishop e2, and queen e7. Black is absolutely fine. And black's normal plan to reroute this, his only problem in this position at the bishop on b7 isn't great. His normal plan will be to go rook a d8 and bishop c8 to reroute him, and black is absolutely fine. So moving on to, I think, the most critical line is d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, knight c3, knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d3, bishop d6, bishop d3, castle, castle, dc4, bishop c4, b5, bishop e2, bishop b7. Here, I think the most critical try is e4. And after e5, d takes e5. And then after knight takes e5, white will move this knight to try to get f4 through. The best one is probably knight d4, which requires a fair amount of knowledge. And I had a nice novelty after knight d4 that I was happy to share. But knight h4 is also a very serious move, with the hope to play f4 next. And here I like the move g6, when after f4, white could also try bishop g5, which, well, you'll have to get the course to be ready for. But after f4, bishop c5 check, king h1, knight e g4. I believe white's best move now is e5, and after knight f2 check, rook takes f2, bishop f2, knight f3. White's about to go f5 and bring the bishop out. He has very good compensation for the exchange, but again, I think if black is ready for this, and he needs to be ready, he should be doing fine. So instead, though, white can play g3 with the hope to stop knight f2 because the king is safe, and he's ready to play bishop f3 and neutralize the long diagonal. This was the recommendation of Dvor and Kolyasevich in a modern chess series. And after b4 here, knight d1, bishop d4, bishop f3, c5, and queen g2. This position is very, very dangerous for black because if white is able to play e5, force the exchange of these bishops, get this knight back to f3, and then play h3 and kick this knight away, black could quickly find his pieces being booted backwards. And here Kolyasevich believed white was better, but he didn't have the best engines available at the time like we did today. And I found a very nasty novelty here. It's not the most important novelty in the course, but it's definitely the flashiest, which is that after queen d7, h3, black can play h5 to bolster this knight, pointing out that if h takes g4, he can take back, and then this bishop has to move away, e4 will fall, and white will lose his queen, and the game shortly afterwards. So after h3, h5, white can try e5, but here after knight d5, black is okay, and after h takes g4, bishop e4, it looks like white's a piece up, but black can take the long diagonal away with a very energetic idea of playing f5, e takes f6, and rook a e8. This idea to play h5 and f5 and rook a e8 was a novelty that I found, and that that the computer didn't originally get, and I was very happy with. And here already, white's actually in massive trouble because he's facing a disaster. This bishop cannot move away, it cannot be defended, and black is potentially about to sacrifice, open the long diagonal, and be down a lot of material, but ultimately give checkmate to this lonely king while white's pieces are unable to defend. So this was definitely the flashiest novelty that I gave in the course. It's probably not the most important one in terms of the theory because this line isn't super common. But it is very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And I saw white win quite a few games when that repertoire came out. Because this position, if you don't know this idea to play h5, after h3, if you end up playing knight h6 here, being forced backwards, and white goes f5 and hits your knight, and then you have to go king g7 to defend it, and after e5, you are getting blown off the board in just like 3 moves. So I was very happy, and it's very important that you find this novelty, because if you don't have it, you're just going to be much worse. And this is the kind of thing that I was very happy with finding this analysis. And within this teaser that you're getting for free without having to buy the full course, this is definitely the coolest thing and the most important one that I'm willing to share. And you'll see a lot of other ideas like this that will change the nature of the position and change the state of theory if you go ahead and buy the real course. So moving on, instead of this, white can also play into the mainline Moran here, and after d takes c4, bishop c4, b5, bishop e2 is the main move, but bishop d3 is also possible. And here I quite like the idea of playing bishop b7, and after a3, rook c8, and here white can play b4 to try to stop c5. I don't think it works very well. His best try is knight g5, which has always been considered critical, but when Anand dropped this novelty c5 on the board and entered the chaos, after bishop takes h7, check, king h8, and f4, we get a very complicated position. White also can take on h7 with the knight in this position. That was Aronian's choice. And while he lost very quickly, white's play can be improved upon. Still, black is doing very well there. After bishop h7, check, king h8, f4, everyone was always playing g6 here, which I think is very interesting and not necessarily bad. But I came up with a novelty to play c takes d4, e takes d4, and then now and only now g6, with the points that now this knight is pinned. And after bishop takes g6, f takes g6, white should play queen takes g6 here. And the computer thinks white is much better. It is wrong. I found a way to bust what the computer was recommending, which again, you'll have to go into the real course for. But after knight takes e6, which is a very human move, aiming to go after this rook, queen b6, white can take the rook, but then his position isn't so great because black gets to take on d4 with check with active pieces. Here we see why white should have taken on g6 with the queen first, is because now, without the knight on g5, black is free to play rook g8, abuse the g-file. There is no queen h6 with mate, and there is no knight f7 with mate. White has to play queen h6 anyway, but after knight h7, black's king is totally safe, while the same cannot be said for white's king. His position is completely falling apart. Black is ready to potentially black has 2 very major threats. One is to take on g2, but he's also threatening to take on he can also threaten bishop f8 and pinning this knight on e6 and forcing white's queen away, and then taking his stuff. And here black is already much better. So finally, we're going to move on to the last thing I'm going to share here, which is after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, e3, e6, knight f3. Again, between knight c3, e3, and knight f3, white can use any move order, but after bishop d3, dc4, bishop c4, b5, bishop d3, bishop d6, white can also try omitting queen c2. After a3, bishop b7, castle, castle. Here, white's best move is queen c2, which will reach the variation that we just discussed after rook c8, knight g5, or rook c8, b4, which I was rude enough to not tell you about and will not share here. But here, white can also try to play e4. But in general, you're always going to meet e4 with e5, and this position is no exception. After e4, e5, white's already slightly worse. For example, the main thing he would try to do is h3, just to get the bishop out to e3 without running into knight g4. But after a6, bishop e3, queen c7, black is going to quickly be able to play e takes d4 and c5 when his pieces will spring to life. After queen c2, e takes d4, knight takes d4. The final important move, if you're to play c5 here, knight f5 might be annoying. The knight's always really good there. But starting with g6 is very nice, keeping the knight off of f5. And black is ready to play c5 next when his pieces spring to life and he has a fantastic position. So Of course, white can also play bishop g5 on the fifth move here, for example, after knight f3, e6. So of course, in this position, white can play bishop g5 too. And here black has some interesting options. He can play h6 and then d takes c4, which would enter the Moscow, or he could play d takes c4 right away, which enters the Botvinnik. In both cases, we have a very sharp position. And while bishop g5, I believe, is the most critical move, I actually quite like this third option, which is knight bd7, the Cambridge Springs, which is a much quieter variation with much less theory. And in general, while that's not necessarily a specific reason to do something, I quite like that people who played bishop g5 here are looking for a fight with white. They really want a very messy position, and after knight bd7, they get a more strategic game, and one where I believe black is fine. After e3, black can play queen a5. This is an important move because if black were to develop normally with, I don't know, bishop e7, after bishop d3, if white's able to complete his development, he should be fine, or very comfortable at least. But by starting with queen a5, black is making direct threats to play knight e4 next, and this forces Soda white into action. After c takes d5, knight takes d5, white can play either queen d2 or rook d1, or rook c1, excuse me. Rook c1 is the recommendation of Camille Plichta in a course here, and has been one of the main moves of top players recently. But I quite like this idea to play knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop a3, rook c2, and now b6, hoping to play bishop a6 next and swap these bishops before white can get castled. If you were to castle first after bishop d3, b6, castle, because now that you've been too slow, after bishop a6, because white's already castled and the c-pawn is no longer pinned, after c4, white can avoid the exchange of pieces, and since he has more space and your bishop on a6 sucks and his bishop on d3 is excellent, here black is worse. So you want to go b6 next. And here after bishop d3, bishop a6, castles, and bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. White didn't have to play this way. He also could play bishop e2 here, which is probably a somewhat more challenging move. But nonetheless, after bishop d3, bishop a6, castle, bishop takes d3. Again, castle would be wrong because of c4. But now that we've taken and castle, here white has a little bit of extra space and a somewhat stronger center. But I think that black is doing well with the plan of rook d1, rook fe8, c4, and bishop f8. This works in this particular position, and you want to make sure that you play for c5 later. If you played c5 right away after d5, you get clobbered because after e takes d5, queen takes d5, this knight on d7 doesn't have anywhere great to go, and there's no way to protect it because this bishop on g5 is so well placed. So while you're not ready for c5 yet, you can go bishop f8 first, and after bishop f4, this was the goal of bishop f4 is to prevent e5 because black can play either c5 or e5 to try to break down white's center. So after bishop f4, c5, I think black has a good position. For example, after d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and b5. This is a very messy position, but black has his fair share of counterplay with b5 and these passed pawns moving, and I think black is fine here. White has other ways of playing this Cambridge Springs. For example, he can play with the old main move was queen d2 in this position instead of rook c1, and he has other ways of trying to organize his pieces against this pawn with bishop a6, but well, you're going to have to buy the real course to get that. So white can also try this way with playing the same line after bishop g5, knight bd7, e3, queen a5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, rook c1, takes here after rook c2, b6. Yeah, so this one we're just going to delete, so edit that away because this is a useless variation that shouldn't be there. The other thing that white can try in the Cambridge Springs, I mean, he has some extraneous options that aren't very good, but the other serious thing he can try after bishop g5, knight bd7, e3, queen a5 is to play knight d2 with the point that he's ready to take back on c4 with the knight, which will harass the queen. And here I quite like the move bishop b4. White's main move by far is queen c2, and you're going to have to buy the course to see what happens there. But I actually think the best move is rook c1. This is the one that I had the most trouble with. And because queen a5 and bishop b4 have both exerted a lot of pressure on this diagonal, despite white's seemingly strong control of the e4 square, I think black is able to go knight e4 very comfortably. And after knight e4, he's going to win material because this bishop on g5 is going to hang to the queen. And no matter how white takes this knight, the pawn on a2 will also hang. If knight d e4, d takes e4, a2 is hanging. And here after something like bishop h4, queen takes a2, white has some compensation for the pawn, and black absolutely needs to know what to do, which, as you guessed, I won't share here. But instead, and here I'll check knight c takes e4, d takes e4, and c5, which is a very direct move. And now I think the best move is probably bishop to h4, and then there's a very complicated line that you're going to need to know. In fact, you'll even be sacrificing your queen in that variation, but it turns out okay for black. White can try c5, though, which aims to shut this bishop out and break the coordination of the bishop on g5. And here I quite like the move f6, forcing this bishop back to h4. And now and only now playing b6. The move order is important, and you'll see why in the course later. But after a3, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, taking on d2, king takes d2, b takes c5. White's best try is b4. But after e takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop b7, White has some compensation for the missing pawn, but I don't think it's quite enough. Black seems solid enough. White could also take on c5, but Black's doing quite well here as well. In any case, that will conclude my coverage here in the short and sweet section of the course, and you're going to have to buy the real course to get the rest of it. But I think this was a good teaser as to what kind of quality analysis you can see, because I was happy to share some serious novelties, including only one novelty in this short and sweet in the serious lines. I think it changed the evaluation of the variation at large, and I was very happy with it. And I also I made very sure to address all of the key recommendations in chess literature that are available for White nowadays. Anything that was recommending d4 on the first move, I made sure to look at and find recommendations against, because I know that a lot of, well, I was going to say club players, but also grandmasters too, are using these resources very seriously and trying to take this analysis that people are publishing and using it in their own practice. And I made sure to cover all that. And I also made sure to give good, solid recommendations against all of the sidelines you might face, because a lot of people like to play sidelines nowadays. In any case, I hope this was enough to convince you to buy the course. And if you do buy the course, thank you very much. And I genuinely hope that it will help you become a better chess player and learn the best opening against d4 to the best of your ability to help you win some games. And if you don't buy the course, well, I wish you the best as well. In any case, thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in the videos and the real course.